All right, back with part two here. Something I've already mentioned before, but I want to mention again, reinforce what you've already known. This line here, which is kind of the first line of a function, is called the signature of the function or procedure. It shows the parameters required and the return data type. This is what most user manuals or documentation will show. So this is almost a recipe for how to use this function, right? We see that when we call bsilly, that it has to have two integer parameters and that it's going to return a string value. So for instance, a way that we might want to call this function, we know it just by looking at it. We don't know, maybe we don't know what it does, but I'm going to courier new is what makes it look like ready. Um, if I wanted to call this, I know it's returning a string, so it needs to do something. String word equals be silly, and then two integers, 4 and 6, or whatever I want to do, and that's what this would be a valid command because I know be silly is going to return a string. Notice that if I wanted to, I could print that off, right? I could have done this sort of thing instead of assign it to a new variable. I could have done that. That would have printed it right out to the screen. Certainly, I know that this is returning a string value. Okay. Also notice this word static. The word static means I don't have to have a record. That's what static means, that this is just going to do something. If that word wasn't there, I'd have to have a record involved that would be like student.bsilly or something like that. And we haven't seen that very much, but this is going to become a um, very important thing in, get that, there we go, in grade 12. Okay, this idea of uh, a method or a function that's being called on a record. Okay, so this is a static function doesn't need that part. Okay, but if we left that word out, we'd have to put in, whatever my record dot be silly, whatever the name of the record is that you made. But that wasn't the case here, so don't goof up your notes. I have another example. So this one is uh, here's another method signature, a function signature, and what is it saying? It's saying that I have two double parameters, right? Parameters that are doubles, decimal numbers. Put some arrowheads on those, make it look good. Two double parameters. Make that smaller so it fits better. And what else? It returns, what's the return value? Well, it returns a Boolean. Remember, a Boolean is either true or false. So what I'm guessing, just reading this, is that this function is, if I had to guess, it's supposed to just decide whether num1 or num2 is bigger, because the function name is greater, so that makes sense. Um, Notice that it doesn't have the word static in there. So this is a record type um, method function. So when I called it, like, and I'm going to make that a different font so it stands out. It would look like, and remember, it's returning a Boolean, so it has to do something. Usually we use Booleans in some sort of comparison, right? So it might be in an if statement or a while loop. While is greater, because that's going to return a Boolean. And then in here, I'm going to have my two double parameters, right? Uh, And who knows what the code does, but notice that right now, this would actually give me an error message. Why? It would give me an error message because this function is greater is not a static function. So I'd have to have a record, student 1 is greater, or numbers 1, whatever the record name is, right? Not static. So because that word static's not there, that's why I'd have to have a record that calls is greater, which is pretty strange, and it's, you know, we're reaching into grade 12, but that's fine. That's fine. Better you see it the first time here while we're first being introduced to these concepts, rather than having to digest all that stuff in the new course. All right, onwards. Passing arrays as parameters. You saw this in the Numbers Revisited program. We can pass an array as a parameter as long as both the method receiving the array is expecting an array and we correctly pass the entire array. So we saw in that Get Numbers program that we had array parameters, right? This one was a static method, get highest number, and it was passed the entire array. And then, you know, you filled in the blanks, and that was all good. But that let the array, or the function, know that we were expecting an array. And dandy. And also, then when the get highest number function is called, then main numbers was the name of the array. Notice that main numbers was an array declared and initialized somewhere in the calling program or subprogram. Main in this case. So this was the Numbers Revisited program that we were playing with. And in the highest number, it expected an array function. And when we called it, which was down here somewhere in main, get highest numbers was passed main numbers. And main numbers indeed, somewhere in the right there, was declared as an array. So when I passed main numbers, it indeed was an array. And that seemed to work. A reminder, and we were working through this when we were working through this program last class, that array name.length will give you the size of the array. So a lot of you were worried, well, how do I know how many numbers are in the array so I know when to end my loop? Well, it doesn't matter. You just loop on array name.length, and then that will know exactly how many times to execute your loop, because all arrays know their own length. So that worked. I also want to mention, so this is one that had an array as a parameter, but a function can also return an array. And I want to remind you of that. That happened in this program as well. We had an array called, or a function rather, called get keyboard numbers, and another one called get random numbers, that called in, it had an integer parameter, and that was how many numbers we were supposed to read. So that would be your loop variable there, and it returned a whole array. It was declared here. Notice that numbers was local to this function. Numbers was a local array variable to this function, but then when it was returned, numbers was returned back to the main program. It was returned as main numbers. And so in the main method, the array was called main numbers, and then that was the operations done on that. Notice that in this program, again, there are no global variables. Yeah, okay. The console was a global variable, and that's been happening all year, even though we haven't been quite sure about what's going on. One way we could do, which would be sort of less proper, would be we could have declared a static variable, static array here called global numbers or whatever we want. That could have been our array, and we could have been dealing with that. The problem is we don't know how many or how big to make that array. Certainly, we could just declare it without initializing it and then initialize it later. This would make global numbers a global static variable if we wanted to. Again, the program works just fine without that. It's better style not to use global variables. So there you go. Um, I'm guessing with this renewed information, you may want to revisit your numbers revisited program, finish that off. And also, the very last exercise from the other day, the triangle FP, that'll be a program that you might want to finish off, along with a couple of short exercises after today's lesson, okay? All right, well, have fun with that. We are very close to the end now, ladies and gents.